Dr. Ben Carter's bloodied hands trembled as he cradled the newborn lion cub, its tiny chest barely rising in the suffocating darkness of the Kenyan night. The second heartbeat against his palm made him freeze. There was another one. This wasn't supposed to happen. Lions rarely birth twins. Sarah Thompson's flashlight clattered to the ground, her nurse's instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. Moses Kiprotic stumbled backward, his weathered face pale with recognition as Grace, the lioness, fixed her amber eyes directly on Ben with an intelligence that defied nature. Ben's mind raced back 15 years to another delivery room, another tiny life slipping away in his trembling hands, his daughter Emma's final breath. But Grace wasn't giving up. She was pushing the weaker cub toward him with deliberate, desperate nudges. "Get the medical kit now," Ben commanded, though his voice cracked with the weight of old failures. What was Grace trying to tell them? And why did this lioness trust the very hands that had failed to save his own child? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Dr. Benjamin Carter sat in his empty Montana farmhouse staring at the charity brochure that had arrived with his morning coffee. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight. No Margaret humming in the kitchen, no grandchildren's laughter echoing through the halls that would never come. At 68, Ben had delivered countless foals, calves, and puppies, but he couldn't save the 2 people who mattered most. Margaret's cancer had taken her slowly, methodically, while Emma's car accident 15 years prior had stolen his daughter in an instant of twisted metal and shattered dreams. The Wildlife Conservation Foundation's letter promised purpose. Bring your veterinary expertise to Kenya's most vulnerable animals. Ben's arthritic fingers traced the photographs of lions, his mind calculating the cost. His retirement savings, every penny Margaret had carefully tucked away for their golden years that never came, would barely cover the expedition. But what else was money for when you had no one left to spend it on? 3 states away in Oregon, Sarah Thompson faced her own empty nest with growing desperation. At 62, the retired nurse had perfected the art of filling silence. Morning talk shows, afternoon game shows, evening news on repeat. Her daughter Lisa hadn't called in 3 months, their last conversation ending with the familiar accusation, "You care more about your patients than your own family, Mom." Sarah's hands, once steady enough to start IVs and moving ambulances, now shook as she poured her solitary morning coffee. The same charity brochure arrived on Sarah's kitchen table like divine intervention. She'd spent 40 years healing strangers' children while watching her own daughter drift away. The expedition cost would drain her savings, but Sarah had grown tired of saving money for a future that felt increasingly meaningless. In Washington, D.C., Harrison Wade reviewed the Foundation's books with growing panic. The pediatric oncology bills stacked on his desk told a story of desperation. His son Michael's leukemia treatment costs had skyrocketed beyond insurance coverage. As the charity's director, Harrison had access to substantial donation funds meant for African conservation. The embezzlement started small, just enough for 1 chemotherapy session, but Michael's relapse demanded more, much more. Harrison's phone buzzed with another text from his wife. Michael asking when Daddy's coming home. Treatment starting again tomorrow. The Foundation's upcoming Kenya expedition represented both opportunity and cover. He could delay the audit, buy more time, maybe find a way to replace what he'd taken. The volunteers were just elderly do-gooders seeking purpose. They wouldn't question his authority or dig too deep into the finances. Meanwhile, in Kenya's Masai Mara, Park Ranger Moses Kiprotic tracked the distinctive paw prints of a lone lioness. The locals called her Grace for her unusual tolerance of humans, but Moses knew her by different names. The killer, who'd taken his father 3 years ago during a livestock raid gone wrong. The scars on her left flank told the story of that violent encounter, just as the scars in Moses's heart told his own tale of loss and conflicted duty between protecting people and preserving the very predators that destroyed families. The Kenyan sun blazed mercilessly as Ben Carter stepped off the dusty Land Rover, his veterinary bag clutched against his chest like armor. The 3-day journey from Nairobi had been a blur of bumpy roads and stilted conversations with his fellow volunteers. Sarah Thompson emerged behind him, her nurse's eyes already scanning the makeshift camp with professional assessment. The wildlife conservation base looked nothing like the brochures, a collection of weathered tents and solar panels surrounded by endless savanna that stretched toward a horizon shimmering with heat. "Welcome to paradise," Harrison Wade announced with forced enthusiasm, mopping sweat from his forehead. The charity director had been unusually tense during the journey, constantly checking his satellite phone and muttering about communication difficulties with headquarters. Ben noticed how Harrison's eyes never quite met theirs when discussing the medical supplies budget, always deflecting with vague promises about equipment arriving soon. Moses Kiprotic approached the group with measured steps, his ranger uniform crisp despite the oppressive heat. "Dr. Carter, Ms. Thompson, I am Moses, your guide and protection during your stay." His English carried the musical cadence of Swahili, but his expression remained guarded. "There is something you must see immediately. We have a situation requiring veterinary expertise." The group followed Moses across the dusty compound to where his jeep waited, its canvas top providing blessed shade. As they drove deeper into the conservancy, Ben felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. The vast emptiness reminded him too much of Montana's winter nights when grief pressed down like accumulated snow. Sarah sat beside him, her fingers unconsciously checking her medical supplies, a nervous habit from decades of emergency nursing. "What kind of situation?" Ben asked, his voice rougher than intended. Moses's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "A lioness. She has been unusual in her behavior. Normally, lions avoid human contact, but this one seems drawn to our patrol routes. The locals call her Grace because she has never attacked, even when approached accidentally." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in the front passenger seat. "Now, wait just a minute. I didn't authorize any direct contact with dangerous predators. Our insurance doesn't cover—" "She is pregnant," Moses interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of something Ben couldn't identify. "And I believe she is in distress." The jeep crested a small hill, and there she was. Grace lay beneath an acacia tree's sparse shade, her golden coat darkened with perspiration. Even from 50 yards away, Ben could see the labored rise and fall of her flanks, the way she kept lifting her massive head to scan the horizon before settling back down with obvious discomfort. "My God," Sarah whispered, her professional instincts overriding any fear. "How long has she been like this?" "I first noticed signs yesterday," Moses replied, parking the jeep at a safe distance. "She keeps returning to this spot, pacing, lying down, getting up again. In my experience, this indicates early labor. But something is wrong." Ben's hands began their familiar tremor as he stared at the lioness. The sight of any creature in labor brought back memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Emma's difficult birth 30 years ago, the complications that nearly cost him both wife and daughter, the way Margaret had looked at him with such trust as he'd coached her through those terrifying hours. And later, much later, holding Emma's hand in the hospital as cancer ravaged her young body while he stood helpless, a veterinarian who could heal animals but couldn't save his own child. "We need to call in a specialist," Harrison announced, though his voice lacked conviction. "Someone with proper equipment, tranquilizers, a full surgical team. This is beyond our scope." "The nearest specialist is in Nairobi," Moses said quietly. 8 hours by road, longer if we wait for helicopter clearance. And Grace—" He paused, studying the lioness through binoculars. Grace has chosen this place for a reason. Lions do not make casual decisions about birthing locations. Sarah pulled out her own binoculars, her nurse's training taking over. Her breathing is too rapid, and look at her positioning. She's trying to find comfort but can't. Those are signs of complications. As if summoned by their conversation, Grace raised her massive head and looked directly at their jeep. Ben felt his breath catch as those amber eyes seemed to focus specifically on him. For a moment that stretched impossibly long, human and lioness regarded each other across the dusty space between survival and extinction. "She knows we're here," Ben murmured, surprised to find his voice steady. "And she's not running." Harrison's satellite phone chose that moment to ring with an electronic trill that seemed obscenely loud in the natural silence. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away from the group. "Yes, Michael? What do you mean the treatment isn't covered? We discussed this with insurance." His voice faded as he moved toward the jeep, leaving Ben, Sarah, and Moses to contemplate the laboring lioness and the impossible decision that lay before them. Grace lifted her head again, and this time Ben was certain she was looking directly at him, as if somehow sensing that her fate rested in the hands of a broken old veterinarian who had failed everyone he'd ever tried to save. The evening sky painted the savannah in shades of amber and rust as Grace's condition deteriorated rapidly. What had begun as restless pacing evolved into something far more alarming, prolonged periods of straining followed by exhausted collapse. Ben watched through his binoculars as the lioness attempted to rise, her powerful haunches trembling with effort before she sank back down with a low, guttural moan that carried across the still air. "This isn't normal labor," Sarah observed, her clinical voice masking deep concern. "She's been pushing for over 6 hours with no progression. In humans, we'd call this failure to progress, and it's potentially fatal for both mother and baby." Moses lowered his own binoculars, his face grave. "The other lions are beginning to circle. They can smell weakness, blood, if Grace cannot move soon." He didn't finish the sentence, but Ben understood. A vulnerable lioness would either be driven away from the pride or worse, killed to prevent attracting scavengers that might endanger the other cubs. Harrison returned from his phone call, his face ashen. "That was the hospital. Michael's white blood cell count has crashed and they're moving him to intensive care. I need to get back to Washington immediately." His hand shook as he tried to light a cigarette, the flame wavering in the growing darkness. "You can't leave now," Sarah protested. "We need those medical supplies you promised. Grace is dying." "I never promised anything specific," Harrison snapped, then immediately looked ashamed of his outburst. "Look, I'm sorry, but my son is fighting for his life. A wild animal, no matter how magnificent, doesn't take priority over my child." Ben felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What medical supplies?" "You told us the Foundation had provided a complete veterinary kit." Harrison's silence stretched too long, confirming Ben's growing suspicion. The charity director avoided eye contact, focusing instead on the distant lioness. "There were budget constraints. The board felt that basic first aid supplies would be sufficient for the type of minor interventions we anticipated." "Minor interventions?" Sarah's voice rose dangerously. "You brought a retired veterinarian and a nurse to Africa with a box of Band-Aids and aspirin?" Thunder rumbled in the distance, though no clouds were visible in the star-filled sky. Moses checked his weather radio with practiced efficiency. "Storm system moving in from the west. If it hits tonight, the helicopter cannot land until morning, possibly longer." As if responding to their conversation, Grace released a sound that chilled Ben to his core, a deep primal cry of pain that spoke of suffering beyond endurance. It was the same sound Margaret had made during those final nights when morphine could no longer touch her agony, the sound that still woke Ben from fitful sleep. "I have to help her," Ben said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "With what?" Harrison gestured helplessly. "You have no anesthesia, no surgical instruments, no blood products. This isn't a barn cat having kittens, Ben. This is a 400-pound apex predator in extreme distress." Moses studied Ben with new intensity. "There is something else you should know about Grace." His voice carried the weight of confession. 3 years ago, during the dry season, she led a pride that raided cattle from my village. My father, Kiprotich Sr., went to drive them off with the other men. He paused, gathering strength. Grace killed him, crushed his spine with one swipe when he got between her and her cubs. The revelation hit Ben like a physical blow. Sarah gasped audibly, while Harrison stepped backward as if the lioness might somehow hear and understand the accusation. "You've been tracking your father's killer this entire time?" Sarah whispered. Moses nodded slowly. "At first, yes. I wanted revenge, justice, whatever you wish to call it. But watching Grace these past months, seeing her gentleness with humans despite her power, I began to understand something my father taught me. The lion kills to protect her young, just as men kill to protect theirs. The sin is not in the killing, but in failing to recognize the love that drives it." Ben stared at Grace, now completely still except for the rapid rise and fall of her labored breathing. In the growing darkness, her eyes reflected their flashlight beams like golden coins. "She's trying to bring life into the world, just like every mother I've ever helped." "The species doesn't matter. It matters to the insurance company," Harrison muttered, but his protest lacked conviction. "My father died protecting our livestock," Moses continued, his voice gaining strength. "Grace was protecting her cubs. Both were doing what love demanded. Tonight, I choose to honor that love, not perpetuate the cycle of violence." A distant rumble of thunder, closer now, punctuated his words. Ben could smell rain on the wind, though the stars still blazed overhead. Grace attempted to rise again, her massive frame shuddering with effort before she collapsed with a thud they could hear from 50 yards away. "She's going into shock," Sarah diagnosed, her professional training overriding her fear. "Body temperature dropping, breathing becoming shallow. Ben, if we're going to do something, it has to be now." Harrison's satellite phone rang again, the electronic trill obscenely cheerful in the face of approaching tragedy. "Michael's asking for me," he said after checking the display, his voice breaking. "My little boy is scared and I'm thousands of miles away watching a wild animal die." "Then go," Ben said simply. "Take the Jeep, drive back to camp, catch the first flight home. Moses and Sarah and I will handle this." "With what equipment? What plan?" Harrison's desperation made his voice shrill. "You'll all get yourselves killed for nothing." Ben looked at his hands, noting absently that the tremor had stopped completely. For the first time in 15 years, his surgeon's hands were rock steady. "Sometimes the plan is just to show up and do what love demands. Your son needs you, Harrison. Grace needs us. Go save your boy." As if summoned by his words, the first fat raindrops began to fall, each one hissing against the sun-heated earth. Harrison's departure left an profound silence, broken only by Grace's increasingly labored breathing and the steady patter of rain beginning to intensify across the savannah. Ben watched the red taillights of the Jeep disappear into darkness, carrying with them any hope of conventional medical intervention. What remained was raw human determination, a lifetime of veterinary experience, and the growing certainty that Grace was dying. "We need to get closer," Ben announced, his voice carrying a calm authority that surprised even himself. "From this distance, I can't properly assess her condition or provide any meaningful help." Moses checked his rifle, more from habit than aggression. In my father's time, approaching a lioness in labor would have been considered suicide. But Grace, he studied the motionless form beneath the acacia tree. Grace has never behaved like other lions. Perhaps she understands that we want to help. Sarah gathered what medical supplies they had, basic first aid materials, some antibiotics meant for minor infections, and a small vial of pain medication that Harrison had reluctantly left behind. In 20 years of emergency nursing, I've learned that sometimes you work with what you have, not what you wish you had. The question is, do we have enough? The rain began falling in earnest now, transforming the dusty ground into slippery mud that squelched beneath their boots as they approached Grace's resting place. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the lioness in stark, dramatic flashes. She raised her massive head as they drew near, her amber eyes reflecting their flashlight beams with an intelligence that made Ben's breath catch. "Easy, beautiful," he murmured, falling into the gentle cadence he'd used with countless frightened animals over 4 decades of practice. "We're not here to hurt you. We're here to help bring your babies safely into the world." Grace's response defied everything Moses had learned about wild lion behavior. Instead of rising defensively or issuing warning growls, she settled her head back down and watched Ben with what could only be described as trust. Her flanks heaved with exhaustion, and even in the dim light they could see the tension rippling through her powerful muscles as another contraction seized her. "This is impossible," Moses whispered, though whether he meant Grace's acceptance of their presence or the medical situation itself wasn't clear. Lions simply do not behave this way with humans. Ben knelt 6 feet from Grace's hindquarters, close enough to assess her condition, but far enough to retreat if her mood changed. What he saw made his heart sink. "She's been pushing for hours with no progress. The cub is likely malpositioned, probably breech or transverse. Without intervention, we'll lose them both." "What kind of intervention?" Sarah asked, though her professional experience already provided the answer she dreaded. "Manual repositioning, possibly an emergency cesarean section, in a sterile hospital environment with proper anesthesia and surgical tools." Ben's hands moved unconsciously to his medical bag, knowing it contained nothing approaching what this situation demanded. "We have camping knives, basic sutures, and local anesthetic that might work on a house cat but won't touch a 400-pound lioness." Another contraction rippled through Grace's body, and this time she released a low moan that seemed to echo across the darkening savanna. The sound triggered something deep in Ben's memory. Margaret's voice during Emma's difficult birth, the way she'd looked at him with absolute trust during those terrifying hours when everything balanced on a knife's edge between life and death. "Tell me about your father," Ben said suddenly to Moses, surprising both his companions. "What kind of man was he?" Moses blinked at the apparent non sequitur but answered readily. "He was a teacher before becoming a farmer. He always said that every living thing has a story to tell, and wisdom comes from learning to listen. Even as Grace." He swallowed hard. "Even as she killed him, I think he understood she was protecting her cubs. His last words were about forgiveness. And what would he say about this situation? That Grace has chosen us for a reason, that perhaps his death and her survival brought us to this moment." Moses's voice grew stronger. "My father believed in cycles, that death leads to life, that violence can transform into healing if we have the courage to break the pattern." Sarah had been quietly examining Grace from a safe distance, her nurse's eyes cataloging vital signs and symptoms. "Her breathing is becoming more shallow, and I can see cyanosis around her gums. She's going into respiratory distress. Ben, if we're going to act, it has to be now." The rain intensified, creating a curtain of sound that isolated them in their own desperate bubble of decision. Grace attempted to rise once more, her powerful haunches trembling with effort before she collapsed with a thud that vibrated through the ground. This time, she didn't lift her head. She's giving up, Ben realized with sudden clarity. In all my years of veterinary practice, I've seen it happen. The moment when an animal's will to live simply breaks. We're losing her. Without conscious decision, Ben found himself moving closer to Grace, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was contemplating. "Sarah, I need you to talk me through the anatomy. My large animal experience is mostly with cattle and horses. Lions are different." "Ben, you can't be serious." "One wrong move and she'll kill all three of us." "Look at her." Ben gestured toward Grace, who lay motionless except for her labored breathing. "She's beyond caring about us. She's fighting for her cub's life, just like any mother would. The only question is whether we have the courage to help her." Moses stepped forward, his rifle lowered but ready. "I will watch for signs of aggression. In my years as a ranger, I have learned to read lion body language. If Grace becomes dangerous, I will warn you." Sarah stared at both men as if they'd lost their minds, then suddenly laughed, a sharp, slightly hysterical sound that cut through the rain. 40 years ago, I became a nurse because I wanted to save lives. Tonight, I guess I find out if that still matters." She knelt beside Ben, opening her small medical kit. The positioning of the reproductive tract in large cats is similar to humans, but the birth canal is proportionally longer. "If the cub is breached, you'll need to reach farther than you'd expect." Ben's hands trembled as he approached Grace's hindquarters, but not from fear, from the overwhelming weight of responsibility. Every instinct screamed that this was madness, that a camping knife and determination couldn't substitute for proper surgical facilities. But Grace's labored breathing reminded him that doing nothing guaranteed death, while action offered at least the possibility of life. "Grace," he whispered, his voice carrying across the short distance between them. "I know you don't understand my words, but I lost a daughter once. I couldn't save her, couldn't fix what was broken, couldn't be the father and doctor she needed. But maybe," his voice cracked, "maybe I can save yours." As if responding to his confession, Grace turned her massive head toward Ben and made a sound unlike anything Moses had heard in years of tracking lions, a soft, almost conversational rumble that seemed to acknowledge his presence without alarm. Her amber eyes met his in the flashlight's beam, and Ben felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of grief that had been locked away for 15 years. "She knows," Sarah whispered, wonder replacing fear in her voice. "Somehow she understands that we're trying to help." Thunder crashed overhead, and Grace's body convulsed with another powerful contraction. This time, Ben could see a small, dark shape appearing at the birth opening, the cub's hindquarters, confirming his worst fears about the positioning. "Breech presentation," he announced grimly. "The cub's hips are too wide to pass through naturally in this position." "I have to turn it manually or we lose them both." "Without anesthesia?" Moses asked, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "Sometimes love is the only anesthetic we have," Ben replied, pulling on surgical gloves that Sarah had produced from her nursing supplies. "Grace has trusted us this far. I have to trust that she'll understand we're trying to save her baby." As Ben's hands made contact with Grace's warm, wet flesh, she stiffened momentarily but didn't pull away. The lioness's trust in this moment felt like a sacred covenant, one broken veterinarian's chance at redemption offered by a wild mother's desperate hope for her unborn cub. Ben's hands moved with surgical precision, despite the primitive conditions, his fingers carefully navigating the warm, slippery confines of Grace's birth canal, while lightning illuminated their desperate tableau in stark, dramatic flashes. The cub's positioning was worse than he'd initially feared. Not just breech, but with one tiny leg twisted backward in a way that made natural delivery impossible. "I can feel the heartbeat," Ben announced, his voice tight with concentration. "Strong but irregular. The umbilical cord is compressed, which means we're running out of time rapidly." Sweat mixed with rainwater on his forehead despite the cooling temperature. "Sarah, I need you to monitor Grace's vital signs. Moses, keep watching for other lions. The smell of blood and distress will attract every predator within miles." Grace's massive frame trembled as another contraction seized her, and Ben felt the crushing pressure around his hands intensify dramatically. For a terrifying moment he thought his fingers might be broken, but Grace seemed to sense his presence and the contraction eased just enough for him to continue working. "Easy, beautiful," he murmured, falling back into the gentle cadence that had calmed countless animals over 4 decades. "I know this hurts, but I'm trying to help your baby. Just hold on a little longer." Sarah pressed her stethoscope against Grace's chest, her face grave in the flashlight's glow. Heart rate is becoming erratic, and her breathing is too shallow. She's going into shock from pain and blood loss. "Ben, I don't think she can take much more of this." The cub's leg remained stubbornly trapped, twisted in a position that defied Ben's gentle attempts at repositioning. He closed his eyes, drawing on memories of similar cases with cattle and horses, searching for the technique that might save both mother and baby. The rain drummed against the acacia leaves above them, creating an oddly peaceful soundtrack to their life and death struggle. "I need to make a decision," Ben said quietly. "I can try to force the repositioning, which might work but could cause massive internal damage, or—" He paused, the weight of the alternative settling on his shoulders like lead. "Or I can perform an emergency cesarean section with a camping knife and hope we can control the bleeding afterward." "That's not a decision," Moses said flatly. "That's choosing between certain death and probable death." Grace's amber eyes found Ben's face in the darkness, and for a moment that stretched impossibly long, he felt a connection that transcended species, one parent to another, both carrying the weight of lives they'd failed to save. In Grace's gaze, he saw an echo of his own desperation during Emma's final days, the helpless rage of loving someone you couldn't protect. "She's asking me to try," Ben realized with sudden clarity. "Whatever the risk, whatever the outcome, she's asking me not to give up." Another contraction, stronger than before, and this time Ben felt something shift. The cub's leg straightened slightly, just enough to give him purchase for a careful repositioning attempt. "There," he breathed, his hands working with delicate precision. "Come on, little one, help me help you." Sarah watched Grace's vital signs with growing alarm. Blood pressure dropping, pulse becoming thready. "Ben, whatever you're going to do, it has to happen in the next few minutes." The distant sound of hyenas reached them through the rain, haunting whoops and cackles that spoke of scavengers gathering for whatever tragedy might unfold. Moses checked his rifle again, though they all knew a few bullets wouldn't hold off a determined pack if Grace couldn't defend herself. "Almost there," Ben murmured, feeling the cub's body beginning to rotate into proper position. His hands, steady for the first time in years, worked with an intuitive precision that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his conscious mind. "Just a little more, Grace. Trust me, just a little more." Grace's response defied everything Moses knew about wild animal behavior. Instead of becoming more agitated as her pain intensified, she seemed to relax into Ben's touch, her breathing becoming more controlled as if she understood that fighting would only make things worse. The lioness's trust in this moment felt miraculous, a wild mother's leap of faith in the healing intentions of the very species that had taken so much from her kind. "Incredible," Sarah whispered, watching Grace's vital signs stabilize slightly. "It's like she understands exactly what you're doing." The breakthrough came suddenly. Ben felt the cub's body slip into proper alignment, the twisted leg freeing itself from its trapped position. "Got it," he announced, relief flooding his voice. "The cub is positioned correctly now. Grace, you can push when you're ready." As if responding to his words, Grace's body tensed with the most powerful contraction yet. Ben guided the cub's emergence, his hands supporting the tiny, slippery form as it finally broke free after hours of struggle. The moment stretched impossibly as he lifted the motionless bundle, searching desperately for signs of life. "Is it?" Sarah couldn't finish the question. The cub lay absolutely still in Ben's hands, its golden fur matted and dark, tiny chest showing no movement. Ben's heart plummeted as memories of Emma's stillbirth scare 30 years ago came flooding back. The terrifying minutes when doctors worked frantically to stimulate breathing, the way Margaret had gripped his hand with desperate strength. "Come on," Ben whispered, gently clearing fluid from the cub's nose and mouth with his finger. "Come on, little fighter. Your mama went through hell to bring you here." He began chest compressions with 2 fingers, alternating with gentle puffs of air into the tiny nostrils. Sarah moved closer, her nursing instincts taking over as she helped support the cub's neck and monitor for any signs of response. Grace lifted her massive head, her amber eyes fixed on the motionless form of her offspring. The sound she made was unlike anything Moses had heard from a lion, a low, keening cry that seemed to carry all the grief of mothers throughout evolutionary history. "Please," Ben found himself praying to whatever forces governed life and death in this vast African darkness. "I couldn't save my own daughter, but maybe I can save hers. Just this once. Let love be enough." The cub's tiny chest fluttered. Then again, stronger this time. Suddenly, the small form convulsed with a gasping breath, followed by a weak but unmistakably alive mewing sound that cut through the rain like a declaration of victory over death itself. "Breathing established," Sarah announced with professional calm that couldn't hide her emotional relief. "Heart rate strong and regular, reflexes responding normally." Ben cradled the newborn cub for just a moment longer, feeling the warm weight of new life in his hands, life that had been saved rather than lost, hope that had been earned rather than destroyed. Carefully, reverently, he placed the cub beside Grace's massive head. Grace's response was immediate and profound. She began licking her offspring with powerful, rasping strokes, each one seeming to breathe more life into the tiny form. The cub's mewing grew stronger, and within moments it was attempting to crawl toward the warmth and scent of its mother. "We did it," Sarah whispered, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. Against all odds, with nothing but determination and a camping first aid kit, we actually saved them both. But even as they celebrated this miraculous success, Ben felt something was wrong. Grace's licking had grown frantic, and her body continued to strain as if labor weren't finished. His hands moved back to examine her, and what he discovered made his breath catch in his throat. "There's another one," he announced, his voice barely audible over the rain. "Grace is carrying twins." The second cub's presentation was even more complicated than the first, a transverse lie that would require immediate intervention. But Grace, already weakened from hours of labor and blood loss, might not survive another difficult delivery. Moses stepped closer, rain streaming from his hat brim. "In all my years as a ranger, I have never heard of twin lion cubs. The survival rate for single births is already low in the wild." "But we're not in the wild anymore," Ben said quietly, his hands already moving to assess the situation. "We're in that space between wild and tame, between death and life, where miracles happen if you're brave enough to believe in them." Grace looked up at him again, her amber eyes now holding something that looked remarkably like gratitude mixed with desperate hope. The first cub mewed softly against her massive paw, already beginning to nuzzle toward the promise of milk and warmth. "One more time, Grace," Ben murmured, preparing for what would either be the greatest triumph or the most heartbreaking failure of his long career. "One more miracle for your second baby." The second delivery proved catastrophic from the first moment Ben's hands made contact. Grace's exhausted body had no reserves left for another difficult birth, and the transverse position of the second cub meant that natural delivery was impossible. As Ben worked desperately to reposition the tiny form, Grace's vital signs began crashing with terrifying speed. "She's hemorrhaging," Sarah announced, her voice tight with professional alarm as she watched Grace's gums pale to an ominous white. "Internal bleeding, probably from a torn uterine wall. Blood pressure is dropping fast." Grace's massive frame shuddered with each labored breath, her amber eyes beginning to lose their sharp focus. The first cub, still damp from birth, mewed frantically against its mother's cooling flesh, somehow sensing that the source of all warmth and protection was slipping away. "I can't get the positioning right," Ben said through gritted teeth, his hands working frantically inside Grace's birth canal. "The cub is completely sideways, and every time I try to turn it, Grace bleeds more. We're losing them both." Thunder crashed overhead with violent intensity, as if the very sky was protesting the tragedy unfolding beneath the acacia tree. Lightning illuminated their desperate scene in stark, dramatic flashes. A broken veterinarian, an exhausted nurse, and a grief-stricken ranger all fighting to save lives that seemed destined to slip through their fingers like the rain that poured relentlessly around them. Grace's breathing became increasingly shallow and irregular. Between contractions, she would lift her massive head to look at her firstborn cub, then at Ben, as if trying to communicate something urgent through eyes that were growing dim with approaching death. "She knows," Moses whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "She knows she's dying, and she's trying to tell us something about the second cub." Sarah checked Grace's pulse again, her professional mask slipping to reveal raw grief. Heart rate erratic and weakening, body temperature dropping. "She's going into shock." She looked up at Ben with tears streaming down her face. "I don't think we can save her." The words hit Ben like physical blows, each one echoing with the memory of every life he'd failed to save. Emma's final moments, when all his medical training proved useless. Margaret's last breath when love couldn't overcome cancer. Countless animals he'd lost despite his best efforts. The familiar weight of failure settled on his shoulders like a shroud. "No," he said quietly, then louder, with desperate determination. "No, I will not lose another mother on my watch. There has to be something we can do." He made a decision that went against every principle of veterinary medicine. Using the camping knife Sarah had sterilized over their small gas burner, Ben began an emergency cesarean section in the open savanna with nothing but a flashlight for illumination and rain washing away any hope of sterile conditions. "Ben, this is insane," Sarah protested, even as she moved to assist him. "Without proper anesthesia, without a surgical suite, without blood products for transfusion, this will kill her faster than the hemorrhaging." "She's already dying," Ben replied, his surgeon's hands steady despite the impossible circumstances. "At least this way, we might save the second cub." Grace's response to the incision was heartbreaking. Instead of fighting or trying to escape, she seemed to understand that this violation of her body was an attempt at salvation. She lay still, her breathing labored but controlled, her amber eyes fixed on Ben's face with an expression that looked remarkably like trust mixed with resignation. The second cub was smaller than the first, its tiny body perfectly formed but showing no signs of life. Ben lifted it from Grace's abdomen with trembling hands, immediately beginning the same resuscitation attempts that had saved its sibling. But this cub remained motionless. its body temperature already dropping toward the inevitable cold of death. "Come on," Ben whispered desperately, performing chest compressions on the tiny form. "You fought so hard to be born. Don't give up now." Sarah worked frantically to stem Grace's bleeding, using every emergency technique she'd learned in 40 years of nursing. But the damage was too extensive, and without proper surgical instruments or blood products, their efforts felt futile against the massive hemorrhaging. Grace lifted her head one final time, her gaze moving between her living cub, her dying one, and Ben's anguished face. The sound she made was unlike anything Moses had ever heard from a lion, a low, complex vocalization that seemed to carry layers of meaning beyond simple animal communication. "She's saying goodbye," Moses translated, though how he knew this remained a mystery. "And she's asking you to take care of them." As if summoned by his words, Grace's breathing became increasingly irregular. Her massive frame shuddered once, twice, then went completely still. The first cub's desperate mewing grew more frantic as it sensed its mother's absence, crawling blindly across her cooling flesh in search of warmth and milk that would never come. "She's gone," Sarah announced unnecessarily, her voice breaking as she checked for vital signs that were no longer there. "Grace is gone." Ben stared at the motionless second cub in his hands, then at Grace's still form, then at the first cub whose cries seemed to echo across the vast savanna like an accusation. In this moment, surrounded by death, despite his best efforts, he felt the familiar crushing weight of failure that had haunted him since Emma's death 15 years earlier. The rain intensified, turning the red earth around them to mud stained with Grace's blood. Lightning continued to flash overhead, illuminating a scene of tragedy that felt like divine punishment for his hubris in thinking he could save lives with camping equipment and desperate determination. "We lost her," Ben said numbly, his surgeon's hands still cradling the lifeless second cub. "After everything we went through, all the risk we took, we still lost her." The first cub's cries grew weaker as hypothermia began setting in. Without its mother's warmth and milk, it would survive only hours in the African night. Moses checked his watch, 3:17 a.m., with dawn still hours away and no rescue helicopter able to land until the storm passed. Sarah wrapped the surviving cub in her jacket, trying to provide what warmth she could. "We can't give up on this one," she said fiercely. "Grace died trying to bring her babies into the world. The least we can do is honor that sacrifice by keeping one of them alive." But even as she spoke, they all knew the reality of their situation. A newborn lion cub required specialized formula, controlled temperature, and veterinary care that they simply couldn't provide in the middle of the Kenyan wilderness. They had saved one life only to watch it slip away through their inability to provide what it needed most. Ben looked down at the lifeless cub in his hands, then at Grace's still form, then at the storm raging around them. For the second time in his life, love and determination had proven insufficient against the fundamental cruelty of a world where mothers died and children were left orphaned through no fault of their own. "I'm sorry, Grace," he whispered to the lioness's still form. "I'm so damn sorry I couldn't save you all." Ben cradled the lifeless second cub against his chest, feeling its tiny body growing cold despite his desperate attempts to share his warmth. The storm raged around them with increasing fury, lightning illuminating Grace's still form in stark, accusatory flashes, while thunder seemed to mock their failed rescue attempt. Sarah worked frantically to keep the surviving cub warm, but even in the darkness they could all see it was weakening rapidly without its mother's milk and body heat. "This is my fault," Ben said quietly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I should have focused on saving Grace instead of trying to deliver the second cub. My arrogance killed them both." Moses knelt beside Grace's massive form, his weathered hands gentle as he closed her amber eyes. My father always said that the measure of a man is not in his victories, but in his willingness to fight for what is right, even when victory seems impossible. You gave Grace and her cubs a chance when no one else would. But Ben's self-recrimination ran deeper than Moses could reach. This moment felt like the culmination of 15 years of failure, Emma's death, Margaret's suffering, and now Grace's sacrifice, all because he'd believed he could heal what was fundamentally broken. The weight of accumulated loss pressed down on him like the storm itself, threatening to crush what remained of his faith in redemption. Sarah suddenly stopped her ministrations with the surviving cub, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond the storm. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "Do you hear that?" Through the rain and thunder came a sound that made Ben's heart skip, a weak, mewing cry that seemed to emanate from the lifeless cub in his arms. He looked down in disbelief as the tiny form stirred slightly, its chest moving with the faintest suggestion of breath. "That's impossible," he breathed, immediately beginning chest compressions again. "It's been nearly 10 minutes without oxygen. Even if it survives, there could be severe brain damage from—" The cub's eyes suddenly opened, amber like its mother's, and fixed directly on Ben's face. The tiny mouth opened in a stronger cry that cut through the storm like a declaration of defiance against death itself. Within moments, the small form was struggling weakly in Ben's hands, its primitive instincts already searching for warmth and nourishment. "Miraculous," Moses whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "I have never seen anything like this in all my years with wildlife. It is as if Grace's spirit refused to let her second child go." Sarah immediately began checking the revived cub's vital signs with shaking hands. Breathing established, heart rate strong but rapid, body temperature dangerously low but rising. This cub was clinically dead, Ben. What we just witnessed defies medical explanation. But even as they celebrated this impossible resurrection, a new crisis emerged. The surviving cubs, both desperately hungry and hypothermic, began crying with increasing urgency. Without Grace's milk, they would survive only hours before dehydration and starvation claimed them. "We need to get them back to camp immediately," Sarah announced, wrapping both cubs in her jacket. "They need formula, heat lamps, veterinary monitoring. Every minute we delay reduces their survival chances." Moses checked his radio, his face grim in the flashlight's glow. "The storm has washed out the main road. Even if we could reach our vehicle, we cannot drive in these conditions, and the helicopter cannot land until morning at the earliest." Ben stared at the two tiny forms nestled against Sarah's chest, their weak cries a constant reminder of how precarious their situation remained. Grace had entrusted him with her children's lives in her final moments, and now he faced the devastating possibility that his inability to provide proper care would make her sacrifice meaningless. Then, through the storm, came an unexpected sound, the distant rumble of an engine approaching through the rain. Headlights pierced the darkness, growing brighter as a familiar Land Rover struggled across the muddy terrain toward their position. "Harrison," Sarah breathed as the vehicle drew closer. "He came back." The charity director emerged from the driver's seat, his expensive clothes soaked within seconds, but his face showing none of his earlier reluctance. "The storm grounded all flights out of Nairobi," he called over the rain. "I couldn't leave knowing you were out here with no backup." But it was what Harrison carried that transformed their desperate situation. From the Land Rover's cargo area, he pulled a veterinary emergency kit that was far more comprehensive than anything they'd seen before. Incubators, specialized formula, heating units, and medical supplies that could sustain newborn cubs for days. "Where did this come from?" Ben asked in amazement, as Harrison set up a portable incubator with practiced efficiency. Harrison's face showed deep shame mixed with determination. I stole it from the Foundation's emergency reserves, along with about $50,000 worth of other equipment that I've been hiding to cover my embezzlement. He looked up from his work, meeting Ben's eyes directly. My son is dying, and I've been stealing from wildlife conservation to pay for treatments that insurance won't cover. But watching you risk everything for Grace made me realize that some things matter more than my own desperation. The confession hung in the storm-charged air like a lightning strike itself. Sarah and Moses exchanged glances, processing this revelation while Harrison continued setting up life support equipment for the cubs with hands that shook from more than cold. Michael's latest test results came back while I was driving to the airport, Harrison continued, his voice breaking. The experimental treatment failed. The doctors are recommending hospice care. He carefully placed the first cub into the warming incubator, his movements gentle despite his emotional state. I've spent months stealing money to fight death, and you've spent one night actually defeating it. The irony isn't lost on me. Ben watched Harrison work with professional competence despite his personal crisis, seeing in the charity director's actions a reflection of his own desperate need for redemption. "You came back," Ben said simply. "When it mattered most, you chose to help rather than run." That's not the action of a man without honor. The cubs responded immediately to the controlled environment of the incubators, their cries becoming stronger as heating elements restored their body temperature and formula began satisfying their desperate hunger. Sarah monitored their vital signs with growing optimism, her nursing experience translating seamlessly to wildlife care. "They're stabilizing," she announced with wonder in her voice. "Both cubs are feeding well, body temperatures returning to normal ranges. Against all odds, I think they're going to survive." Moses stood vigil over Grace's still form, rain streaming from his hat as he maintained a traditional African farewell ritual. "She gave everything for them," he said quietly. "Her life, her trust in us, her faith that love could overcome the ancient barriers between human and lion. We must ensure her sacrifice was not in vain." As if responding to his words, both cubs settled into peaceful sleep within their mechanical wombs, their tiny chests rising and falling with the steady rhythm of secured life. The storm began to show signs of breaking, lightning becoming less frequent and thunder moving toward the eastern horizon. Harrison completed the equipment setup, then sat heavily on the Land Rover's tailgate, exhaustion and grief written across his features. "I'll turn myself in to the authorities when we return to Nairobi," he said quietly. "The Foundation deserves better than a director who steals from conservation to chase false hope for his dying son." "No," Ben said firmly, surprising everyone, including himself. "You'll return the money, yes. You'll face whatever consequences your actions deserve. But you'll also help establish a permanent wildlife medical program here, using your skills and connections to ensure that what happened tonight never has to happen again under such desperate circumstances." Sarah looked between the two men, seeing in their faces the complex intersection of failure and redemption that had brought them all to this impossible moment. "Grace trusted us with something precious," she said, her hand resting gently on the incubators. "These cubs are more than just animals now. They're symbols of what's possible when people choose courage over fear, hope over despair." Through the breaking clouds, the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, revealing the full scope of their night's work. Grace's still form lay peaceful beneath the acacia tree, while her children slept safely in their artificial environment, saved by the combined efforts of a broken veterinarian, a lonely nurse, a conflicted ranger, and a desperate father who had chosen redemption over escape. The storm was ending, but the real work was just beginning. Dawn broke over the Kenyan savanna with gentle fingers of gold and amber light, illuminating a transformed landscape where tragedy had somehow alchemized into hope. The cubs, now 12 hours old and thriving in their incubators, had survived their first critical night with vital signs that amazed even Sarah's experienced medical assessment. Ben sat beside their mechanical wombs, his weathered hands pressed against the warm glass as he watched the tiny forms sleep with the peaceful rhythm of secured life. "They're beautiful," whispered Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the wildlife veterinarian who had arrived with the Dawn helicopter. Her examination of both cubs revealed remarkable health despite their traumatic birth. Neurological responses are excellent, feeding patterns are strong, and their body temperatures have stabilized completely. "What you accomplished here last night defies everything we know about wilderness emergency medicine." Harrison stood nearby, his satellite phone pressed to his ear as he spoke quietly with his wife back in Washington. The conversation carried threads of grief and acceptance. Michael's condition had deteriorated further during the night, but Harrison's voice held a new quality of peace that had been absent during their entire African expedition. "Yes, honey. I'll be home tomorrow," he said softly. "And I have some difficult things to discuss with you about my choices these past months. But I also have something beautiful to share. A story about courage and second chances that I think Michael would love to hear." Moses emerged from the traditional burial ceremony he'd conducted for Grace, his face streaked with ritual clay and tears that spoke of both grief and closure. "It is finished," he announced quietly. "Grace rests with honor beside the acacia tree where she fought so bravely for her children's lives. The elders from my village have declared this ground sacred. No hunting, no development, only protection for as long as the earth remembers her sacrifice." Sarah cradled the smaller cub, now named Hope, who had awakened and was nuzzling against her with startling affection. The larger cub, whom they'd named Grace in honor of his mother, remained contentedly in Ben's arms, his amber eyes, so reminiscent of his mother's, gazing with apparent recognition at the man who had delivered him into the world. "I've never seen anything like this bonding behavior," Dr. Walsh observed with professional fascination. "Typically, hand-raised lion cubs remain wild at heart, showing minimal attachment to human caregivers, but these two seem to have formed genuine emotional connections during their critical first hours." Ben felt tears sliding down his cheeks as Grace Jr. made a soft purring sound and curled closer against his chest. For 15 years he'd carried the weight of Emma's death like a stone in his heart, convinced that his medical skills were cursed to fail when they mattered most. But holding this tiny life that he'd helped save, feeling the warm weight of successful intervention rather than devastating loss, something fundamental shifted inside his wounded soul. "I want to adopt them," Ben announced suddenly, surprising everyone including himself. "Not for a zoo or research facility, but here, in Kenya, with proper permits and veterinary support. I want to establish a wildlife medical foundation where retired doctors and nurses can come to make a difference in conservation efforts." Dr. Walsh raised her eyebrows skeptically. "Dr. Carter, hand-raising lion cubs is extraordinarily complex and expensive. They'll need specialized care for at least 2 years before they can be considered for release back to the wild, if that's even possible given their human imprinting." "Then I'll stay," Ben said simply, his decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. "I'll sell my Montana property, liquidate my retirement accounts, and establish a permanent base here. Sarah, Moses, even Harrison, if he's willing, we can build something lasting from what happened here last night." Sarah looked up from Hope, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, and Ben saw his own transformation reflected in her tear-filled eyes. "I was going home to an empty house and endless afternoons of game shows," she said quietly. "But these cubs need experienced medical support, and I've never felt more needed or more alive than I did last night." Harrison ended his phone call and approached the group, his face showing the complex mixture of grief and resolution that comes with accepting unchangeable tragedy while choosing meaningful action. "Michael asked me to tell you all something," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "He said that if lion cubs can fight so hard to live, then he can face whatever comes next with courage, and he wants to donate his college fund to help establish your foundation." Moses nodded slowly, his weathered features showing the wisdom that comes from understanding cycles of loss and renewal. "My father's death brought me to this moment of healing. Grace's death brought new life and purpose to all of us. Perhaps this is how the world balances its accounts, through love that transcends the boundaries we think separate us." Dr. Walsh examined the legal and practical requirements with growing enthusiasm. The Kenyan Wildlife Service has been seeking innovative conservation partnerships, a foundation focusing on emergency wildlife medicine, staffed by experienced American medical professionals, could serve as a model for similar programs across Africa. As they talked, Grace Jr. opened his amber eyes and looked directly at Ben with an expression of trust, so complete it took his breath away. The cub's tiny paw reached out and grasped Ben's finger with surprising strength, as if claiming him as family, with the same certainty his mother had shown in trusting him with her life. "Look at that," Sarah marveled, as Hope similarly attached herself to Sarah's finger. "They know who saved them. They know who belongs to them now." The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and drying the last traces of the night storm. A radio crackled with news that Harrison's flight to Washington had been rescheduled for the following day, giving him time to begin the legal process of returning the embezzled funds and establishing the medical foundation as partial restitution for his crimes. Ben felt a profound sense of completion as he held Grace Jr. and watched the Kenyan landscape come alive with the sounds and movements of a new day. The crushing weight of grief that had defined his existence for 15 years had transformed overnight into something entirely different. Not the absence of loss, but the presence of purpose that made loss bearable. "Grace knew," he said quietly, speaking as much to the sleeping cub in his arms as to his companions. "Somehow she knew that saving her cubs would save us too. That giving us something to protect and nurture would heal wounds we thought were permanent." As if in response to his words, both cubs stirred simultaneously, their amber eyes opening to gaze at their human family with expressions of complete trust and belonging. The morning light caught their golden fur, making them glow like small manifestations of hope itself, living proof that love, courage, and determination could indeed triumph over the fundamental cruelties of a world where mothers die and children are left orphaned. In that moment, surrounded by unlikely family forged through shared purpose and sacrifice, Ben finally understood that redemption doesn't erase the past. It transforms it into the foundation for a future worth building. At 68, Dr. Ben Carter thought his purpose had died with his daughter Emma 15 years ago. Like so many of us who've reached our golden years, he carried the weight of what-ifs and if-onlys that come with a lifetime of love and loss. But in the darkest storm of a Kenyan night, holding a dying lioness's newborn cubs, Ben discovered something profound. It's never too late for a second chapter of meaning. When Grace, the lioness, pushed her weakest cub toward Ben in her final moments, she wasn't just asking him to save her baby, she was offering him the chance to save himself. This story reminds us that our greatest failures can become the foundation for our most meaningful victories. The trembling hands that couldn't save his daughter became the steady hands that delivered new life. The empty house that echoed with loneliness transformed into a launching pad for a wildlife foundation that would save countless lives. Ben learned what many of us forget. Purpose doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. Our scars become our qualifications to heal others. Our losses teach us what truly matters. Sometimes, the family we're meant to protect isn't the one we expected. What second chapter is calling to your heart? Have you found purpose in unexpected places after loss? Share your story in the comments below. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.